Dr. Frank Putnam has famously said, "The prevention of child maltreatment is the single most powerful way to improve the mental and physical health of our nation." In his book, Old Before Their Time, A Scientific Life Investigating How Maltreatment Harms Children and the Adults They Become, Frank Putnam, MD, has explained exactly how this works. Childhood trauma, particularly sexual abuse, has tentacles that reach into adulthood and across generations. In a distinguished and sometimes controversial career that has encompassed research, treatment, and activism, child psychiatrist Frank W. Putnam has documented the long-term mental, physical, and social consequences of childhood maltreatment and neglect. Part memoir, part call to action, Dr. Putnam's Old Before Their Time gives an inside look at a scientist negotiating the politics of established medicine and partisan politics in a quest to understand and heal wounded children and the adults they become. Dr. Putnam co-founded the pioneering Female Growth and Development Study, which for more than 3 decades has followed sexual abuse survivors. The Female Growth and Development Study's rare longitudinal data about everything from morbid obesity to mental illness has informed more than 60 peer-reviewed articles, as well as Bessel van der Kolk's New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score. Childhood maltreatment, Putnam argues, is the largest preventable cause of certain major mental illnesses and interpersonal violence and much hard drug use. All right, I'm so honored to have Dr. Putnam as our guest. Let's get to the interview. Thank you, Dr. Frank Putnam, for coming onto the podcast today.
Thank you very much for having me. I really look forward to our conversation. I particularly enjoy talking about issues with the foster care, for adoptive care. This is a population I've worked a lot with.
Excellent. Yes. And, you had your career has spawned over 200 published research papers and 4 books, at least. Is this your 5th book or?
It's my 4th book.
4th book. Okay. So the book we're going to discuss and some of the research behind it, along with other things, is Old Before Their Time, A Scientific Life Investigating How Maltreatment Harms Children and the Adults They Become, which was just published in December 2025 on Routledge. And you've got a lot to say about this topic from many different angles, including the biological data. So could you, for the listeners who are new to your topic, could you kind of bring us up to speed a little bit on kind of the grand kind of overview of what started your interest in this
Certainly.
topic?
So I started out working. Well, actually, I started out working with rapid cycling bipolar patients at the National Institute of Mental Health. I was very interested in people who were experiencing rapid transitions in mental state. And in that context, I encountered a number of what we now call dissociative identity disorder patients, though they were often misdiagnosed as rapid cycling bipolar patients. And all of them told me they had been this way since they were children. And I thought, if that's true, I should be able to locate children who have this disorder. So I began circulating a profile of what I thought a child with this disorder might look like. And that brought me into contact with a lot of fairly troubled children, mostly brought in by foster care parents, adoptive parents, foster care agencies, therapists working with these children, sometimes juvenile justice situations. And in the context of that, I felt a lot of different things happening to these children. Some percentage of them had a dissociative disorder. But a lot of them were behaviorally disturbed. I felt they were also biologically dysregulated, and that this needed a much more careful study. This is 1987. There's really not very much at all at this time. In fact, hardly any recognition of sexual abuse, for example. The battered child syndrome was bringing physical abuse to people's attention, but sexual abuse was still not well recognized. And I was fortunate to connect with a developmental psychologist named Penny Trickett, Penelope Trickett. Unfortunately, Penny's deceased, but Penny and I sort of mapped out a study of sexually abused girls, ages 6 to 15, when they came in into the study. So we sort of spanned puberty. That was very important to us because this is a period in child development when many girls particularly develop sort of mental health issues and mental health problems so we wanted to be able to span that, but then we also wanted to follow that cross section forward in time, creating what's called a cross sequential design. And we have followed them into middle age at this point in time. They're in their 40s by and large now, and early 50s. And we've seen them 8 different times. We've collected a lot of psychological data. We collected a lot of biological data, particularly hormonal systems like stress response systems, gonadal systems, looking at things like immune competence in them, and also looking now more recently at epigenetic kinds of markers such as methylation of CPG sites. And we also did a lot of psychological testing, as you can imagine, and looked at their behavior. We looked at their social support systems. We looked at, therapy responses in them. We looked at a great deal of things, but we also were looking at their mothers. For the first 4 times we saw them, majority of the sample was still minors. So we had their mothers come in, or in some cases their adoptive mothers, biological, and we I just mentioned these are all Child Protective Services substantiated cases of sexual abuse occurring in the family context. So these weren't trafficked kids; these were your more typical sexual abuse cases that occurred in the family context, usually. And we assisted some family member or a close friend of the family or a live-in boyfriend be the perpetrator. So we were looking at was sort of the more classic experiences for women in this country. And we have followed them out, as I said, into middle age with the 8 different assessments of them, and really found a number of ways in which these experiences are sort of biologically and behaviorally embedded in their lives, and then express themselves at different points in time. And the title of the book is All Before Their Time. And sort of the biggest take-home argument here is that we are finding that they're biologically accelerated, so that they're aging faster than our comparison group of girls who are matched demographically. And this probably accounts for many of the facts that they have many more medical problems than the comparison group. And it fits with a lot of data we have from other studies, particularly the ACE studies, which find this effect of cumulative trauma leading to more frequent chronic illnesses and actually premature mortality.
Okay, goodness. So this sort of,
I know, a lot, right?
well, I mean,
Whoa.
it's sort of like we talked a little off camera about, the ACE study and how adverse childhood events could lead to all these chronic illnesses. But you're looking at a specific longitudinal study, the female growth and development study of females that were sexually abused in their own families and in their household, usually over 3 generations. And you're seeing biological markers of aging
very much
that are even and does that also correlate to disease, or just more like certain markers looking for aging and other issues going on?
Well, they have far more medical problems than our comparison group. So they make about twice as much use of medical care. They have problems like they're more than 2.5 times more likely to have a premature child themselves.
Hmm.
And we looked at all their children also. Well, 90% of their children we also looked at. So we actually had three generations. We had the original girls, who we have looked at very intensively. We had their mothers who came in, who we looked at for four different evaluations. And we have the children of our original children, about 90% of them. So we actually have looked at also a lot of factors associated with the transmission of risk for maltreatment across generations. And we really see that the mothers of our original children have much higher rates of the same kinds of maltreatment, particularly sexual abuse. And the children of our maltreated children have more children in the Child Protective Service system than our comparison children of children, if that makes sense.
Yeah. So summary would be that the mothers of these women, now girls then, um, experienced often high rates of abuse or issues themselves, and then now the longitudinal study, a lot of them not only have a greater rate of doctor visits and disease and issues with medical, but also a greater rate of children in CPS custody and having children young. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, exactly right.
So essentially, we could say that the abuse is almost like a intergenerational trauma that's being passed in a way, somewhat biologically, but also behaviorally. Is that what I'm hearing?
Yes, I think that's a very important point, that the abuse is there's a risk for abuse that's intergenerational. Now, it doesn't mean, and I think it's very important to state, right up front, that if you've been an abused child, it doesn't mean you're going to necessarily become an abusive parent by any means.
Oh, yes.
And the data on that, our data on that, and I've looked at that very intensely because I'm very interested in what this intergenerational mechanisms are for this, is that 2/3 of individuals who are abused as children do not become abusers as parents. Okay, so the majority, more than the majority, 2/3 of them, really closer to 70% of them, but there's that 30% that does. And they will have an abusive child. Again, it doesn't mean that they were necessarily the perpetrator of the abuse, but often that they have connected in a system where their spouse or their partner is the abuser. And so they've increased the risk there for their children, their offspring, to become abusive. Often their partner is not the father of their children, for example. That 30% figure is about 6 times higher than what I'd call the sort of spontaneous rate for parents who were not abused who become abusive or have abused children. And does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely. So, yeah, I'm just hearing not only possible behavioral issues, but they were more likely to become victims of other people in their lives. Is that what I'm hearing?
Absolutely. The re-victimization rates for the maltreated girls are more than almost really 3 times higher than the re-victimization rates are for our comparison girls. And again, they're demographically matched, so it's the income and education and whether they were in one or two parent families and those sorts of things. So that having been abused as a child within your family increases your risk for maltreatment by people outside of your family as a teenager and adult.
My goodness, yes, and oftentimes, and the research is showing this. Obviously, the A study, this study. Now, there used to be sort of a stigma for people that had issues in their family like this, and what we're seeing, I guess, what I'm seeing is that there's clear data showing that these people that are born into these families are at a greater risk of multiple types of problems, including victimization and other maladies, I suppose. What are some of the ways that you measured the biological aging?
So we looked at, as I think I mentioned, we looked at the first of all puberty, and this is one of the things that struck me clinically when I first began working with these children who were brought to me for their sort of dissociative and troubled behavior, was that they seemed physically and certainly behaviorally more mature, and many of them were sort of hypersexual. And that was one of the areas, and I'm sure if you've worked in the foster care system, you know this is one of the things that gets kids kicked out of foster care placements is sort of sexualized behavior, along with aggressive behavior.
Hmm.
So that was one of the things and it was something that we could fairly discreetly measure. There's a series of scales called the Tanner scales, or the sexual maturity scales. And so every time we saw the kids, we had the nurse rate them on their sexual development. And we also drew hormones. We drew estrogen and progesterone and FSH and LH and the sex hormones, looking at their maturation. And we were finding that they, on average, are maturing physically about a year earlier than our comparison girls. And that might not sound like a lot, but it actually is if you're, a 6 or 7 year old child and you're starting to develop secondary sex characteristics and that sort of thing. It really increases them being targets,
Hmm.
and they also get. We just know statistically they're more likely to get into various kinds of trouble, to have earlier pregnancies, to start using substances earlier, tobacco, alcohol, drugs, and to get involved in risky behavior. And often it is because there are older males who are who are introducing them to these sorts of things. So when we looked at their social networks, and we looked at the sort of the social networks all along for all of the participants in the study. These girls were these were like 13 and 14-year-old girls hanging out with 17 and 18-year-old guys, and you just know that's a recipe for trouble.
Yeah, absolutely. So, that's getting into the sort of behavioral cultural part of this, is that
But it's
these
driven by this biology in the sense that they're physically much more mature than their peers who were not abused.
right. So then I guess it just depends. You're looking at data, so it's like it's hard to explain. Like, is it both, right? Is it that they're then targeted, by the
Uh,
older males,
I think it's a lot of things.
and then yeah, and
And
then maybe lacking certain, parental supervision or other things going on because there's this socioeconomic, like you said, you did this across socioeconomic boards.
well, most of our subjects are lower socioeconomic. That's simply the way it works.
I
And
see.
we were recruiting from Child Protective Service agencies, but also, I mean, if their parents had this particular, their mothers had very high rates of abuse themselves. Their mothers had high rates of depression. They had
Hmm.
high rates of anxiety. The vigilance that those parents, their parenting was impaired by the vigilance issues,
Hmm.
and these children, and they're in our this particular study, they're all girls. They were involved in a lot of risky behaviors. They were, as I said, hanging out with much older males, which was a huge risk factor. So it is behavior, but the biology also is part of that because they're now physically maturing. That's what's attracting the older males, these really predatory males.
Yeah, that makes sense. So I guess using the data to help, I mean, different groups. I mean, the data for doctors, there's the data for therapy. You could use this data for therapists. What is some of the data? I guess how could some of this data help a person, like a lay person in their life, to understand these sort of things that are going on from your study?
Well, I think that it's actually. pretty explanatory for a lot of these people. Whenever I present these data, and I am often surrounded by women at the podium who afterwards who say, "Oh, thank you. This explains what I've experienced all my life." And I just always thought it was me. And you're saying, no, this is actually a result of the traumatic experiences. A lot
Mm.
of this seems to be operating through abnormalities in the stress hormones. And in particular, we followed a stress hormone called cortisol. Pretty much everybody's heard of
Oh
cortisol. It
yeah.
affects both sort of stress responses, but also things like metabolism. And we find it's, for example, very related to the fact that many of these victims, survivors, have issues gaining a lot of weight, and that we found that is one of the things that really set our abuse group off from our comparison group. That by by about age 18, 17, 18, the average abused girl in the study was heavier than 75% of American girls of the same age.
Wow.
And whereas our controls were tracking the 50th percentile all the way along through this age span, so that they were gaining weight at much faster rates. And often, if you talk to survivors, they talk about struggles they have with weight gaining and keeping the weight off, and that difficulty. And we think this is related, and we have biological data to really support this. It's not definitive, but it supports it. The idea that it's these abnormalities in the cortisol metabolism that seems to be driving the increased adiposity, and which often ends up resulting in obesity and even morbid obesity. And if you know the ACEs study, you think back, the whole ACEs study got started because Vince Folletti was the one who recognized he was running a weight loss clinic, and
Mm.
he had this ability to take 100 pounds off of people, and yet he found they gained it right back.
Yeah.
And he found the thing that characterized the people who had that recidivism in terms of regaining their weight had this very high rate of having childhood sexual abuse. And so we're essentially identifying the biological mechanism that was identified first as a relationship or association in the ACE study. So it builds on the ACE study.
Yeah, absolutely. And so for those people that are just kind of learning about themselves, there can be a sense that oftentimes victims blame themselves for issues, and this could be an eye opener for them about why are they having all these health issues, right?
That,
What's going on here, and also hopefully a call to action if they are able to get counseling and psychotherapy and other psychiatry or whatever other medical treatments. Are there what are you finding with them, with people in your study? Is that something you're keeping track of? Are they getting treatment? Are they?
so that's we did not give treatment, but when we saw these children, we connected them with therapy. But
Mm,
this is, of course, 1987, and we
a little
know very
different.
little about treatment of abused children in 1987.
Right.
Basically found that the therapies moved off of the abuse very quickly and on to troubles that these girls were having with their mothers. And that does seem to be one of the big issues, is that many of them are very angry with their mothers for not protecting them, and more so than they are with the abusers. But back to, this. I think there are a number of there's some short-term benefits, and then there's a bunch of long-term benefits that are probably more important in the long run. In the short term, I think it's validating for these individuals. We know with the children, young children, it's possible to normalize this cortisol change. Now, we don't know yet whether that normalization, that is by putting them in something like foster care, therapeutic foster care, or by getting them into therapy, m- generally making them safe and feel
Hmm.
secure. That's like number one throughout. It's that's the if they need to be safe, and then they need to feel secure. And that's very hard to do, often with the legal system feeling like visitation has to go on with the abuser and those sorts of things.
Hmm.
Um, so if you can do that, you can regularize and normalize that cortisol uh, circadian rhythm. And what we don't know, there's a piece in the development of your stress response, sort of a biology, the HPA axis, hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, that the cortisol goes down naturally, and we call this the cortisol attenuation curve. And it is that piece of that is messed up in the maltreated victims, and that seems
Mm.
to be related to the weight gain. That seems to be related to the accelerated biological aging in some way. When we see that sign of this rapid decrease in the cortisol attenuation curve, where the curve is actually much steeper than it is in the comparison controls. That's related in some way that we're not sure exactly how to many of these very negative kinds of outcomes. So it does say that this is one target. Now, I also think we have some other targets that may really let us actually have biological markers for is therapy working. Some of the genetic things are reversible. The epigenetic changes are reversible, and so the question is, can we actually treat people and see if we're reversing some of the accelerated aging? I can go into that more. It gets into the weeds a bit, but
Well, that
it's
would be amazing. I mean, honestly, I've seen in my career just since 2007 huge breakthroughs in trauma treatment. Um, and I would say we can't just. I mean, it just this is sort of ad hoc. General is that if somebody has had childhood sexual abuse, they often have symptoms of PTSD. It doesn't mean they have post traumatic stress disorder, but they often can experience those symptoms or depression or anxiety from a mental health standpoint, just from what we're seeing as clinicians without seeing all the biological data. And we've seen um, both great strides in how to treat that, but also some roadblocks because certain folks have developed the ability to defend themselves against abuse. And it is that over hypervigilance that's causing all sorts of maladies in their life, even if they feel safe now in the present. So, I mean, certain therapies that we've seen in this therapy world is EMDR therapy and other mind body ones, because as you know, Bessel van der Kolk's, he wrote an intro for your book, but the body keeps the score, right? And in your
yeah.
book, which is old before their time, you're seeing the markers in the body. And so some of these mind body therapies have been able to help certain folks, the extent of which is different for everybody, I'm assuming. But
First, I would absolutely underscore that what you just said. I agree with that. And one of the big sort of general findings is how different it is for everybody.
yes,
So when I talk about this stuff, I'm talking about averages.
yes,
But what we see is that the spread is much, much bigger, even though the average may be on one side or the other. But so people do have different outcomes. But in general, it's not a good thing to have happen to you as a
no,
child.
no. It's horrific, really, because the sense of safety is gone, but then also sexuality and other things can be accelerated, and all sorts of shame and identity and frustration, and all of that. It can just it can be it's just a massive stressor in so many ways.
Yes,
Um,
and it's embedding itself into your psyche. It's embedding itself into your biology. It's embedding itself into your social sort of self also.
Yeah, and I think it's difficult for the general public to understand, who haven't had this happen to them or somebody they know, just how pervasive these sexual abuse and the effects of that can be on a person's personality. They're, like you said, you've been studying the biology, but personality, biology, behavior, self identity. So let's ask a few more. I want to ask you some more questions just because you've
Okay,
got so
go
much to
for
say.
it. Go for it.
Um, Let's talk about, I don't know. I've been kind of hinting at it, but I guess that kind of like the family cycle of violence that occurs in some of these families. And then I'm going to ask you about biology after that.
So,
Just,
so I mean, people have identified the family cycle of violence for a while now, and the big question
yeah.
is like, what is it that keeps it going over and over and over? And when we ask these mothers of our abused children about their mothers, many of them felt that their mothers had probably been abused, so we didn't use that data, but we had data from 3 generations, and
Hmm.
basically it really shows this sort of goes from one generation to another. Well, when you look at, say, the literature, the scientific literature on what are the things associated with the intergenerational transmission, you find about 20 different factors that have been identified at the zero point zero 0.01 level, which for the audience is a pretty high level of significance. Now, some of them are clearly sort of secondary to the processes. I'm quite interested in this. Of course, it's a tricky thing to study because how many generations can you study? And generations are changing all the time. I mean, there's sort of no way the kids growing up today are the same as the kids who were growing up in 1987
Right.
when you think about that. So, I mean, I'm working on a project to actually study this, but and I tell people I tend to study 10,000 generations, and I actually it's meant as a kind of come on, but actually what I'm doing is I'm computer modeling this. Using a particular kind of software called agent-based software, which allows me to actually create people, hundreds of them if I want, thousands of them
Mm.
if I want. They can have histories, they can marry, they can have children, they can do all these things. It's sort of like a huge Sims game, you know.
Wow.
People think about that, and then into them I can embed their socioeconomic status. I can embed events, etc., and I can sort of look at all of this. I can sort of sweep all the parameters
Mm.
and see which ones seem to be the most powerful ones. But generally, I mean, what we see is having had, well, basically having had parents who were maltreated is still a huge risk factor. Having parents who are substance abusers. But of course, people who have been maltreated have higher rates of substance abuse. For example, having parents who are depressed. But again, if you've been maltreated, you have higher rates of depression, which they bring back into their parenting. I worked about 12 years with a parenting project in Cincinnati where we had several thousand first-time mothers, and most of them were unmarried at this point in time, and we worked with them around parenting. And I really feel that this is one place where we could do both prevention by working with the mothers to protect their children, increase that vigilance and that protectiveness, but also working with the mothers to sort of help them heal. The vast, vast majority of these mothers who were not in a clinical program, this was just more of a protective, preventative program. But the vast majority of them were depressed, had real anxiety problems, and also the vast majority of them had maltreatment histories as well as domestic violence histories, those sorts of things. I think the violence prevention, sexual abuse prevention, maltreatment prevention all need to focus at the generational level, and particularly mother and child. Would be important. You're sort of helping the mother is kind of secondary prevention, the child's primary prevention, sort of thing.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, prevention and targeting multiple generations. I mean, oftentimes the difficulty sometimes in psychotherapy and counseling is that in our training as therapists, we're supposed to focus on the family when there's a child, whenever there's an issue with the child behaviorally or something going on, we're supposed to bring in the whole family. But the way that it often works is the parents don't want to come in they don't want to come to the appointments. and they resist any sort of appointment at all. And they say, well, can't you, work on this kid? Can you figure
Yeah, we're
this
going to
out?
drop the kid off and
Yeah.
pick him up, and we expect the kid to be all fixed.
And I'm adamantly against that. I say, okay, well, it's okay to have some privacy. The kid needs some privacy to have some sessions, but the family has to be involved in the process because we don't know the dynamics that are possibly going on here. And that's not even in an abuse case. That's just in a regular behavioral case, let alone an abuse case. We might have to, perhaps the abuser needs to be away from it, but the other family member needs to be present, the protective family member, if there is one.
Yeah.
Right. And that's one of the difficult things about that. I know you've been studying girls and women. What about boys in this sort of same context? I was just curious about that.
Well, I think that's a very important question. We've always wanted to do a parallel study of males,
Mm.
and we have never been able to find a funder to undertake that. This is, I don't know, a couple of $1 million a year study to see all these
Yeah.
people, follow all these people, do these hormones. We saw most people every time they came back for about 8 hours of tests, and there's a lot of in the book about some of the behavioral stuff, and that took time. So it's been very difficult to in fact impossible for us yet to find funding for the males. But what we do know is that the males, it's a kind of a different situation with them. More males are abused outside the context of the home sexually. I'm not talking physically, but sexually here, outside the context of the home, and more often by, uh, coaches, boyfriends, people,
Mhm.
that. So it isn't there. There are some real differences about that experience. For the girls, one of the terrible things for them is the fact that they're always at risk. That because the perpetrators in the home or close to the family, and so not only do they have the episodes, but they also have the sense of always being at risk. That they have to be on their guard, have to be vigilant all the time.
Mhm.
Not and whereas the boys have somewhat of more of a place of safety in the home, kinds of things. The males are also often not only they're abused by sort of older boys,
Mhm.
and some of that occurs in the context of teams and sports and those sorts of things. I mean, some of the hazing is fairly kinds of sexual. The males develop a lot of the same symptoms, but they also have an increased risk for becoming offenders or perpetrators.
Mm.
Uh, and so that's why you do get that relationship between having had a maltreatment experience and then becoming a perpetrator. So that's something that's generally different between the males and the females. You typically don't see males coming into the child protective system much after about age 9 or 10,
Mm.
whereas uh, but that seems to also be the age that we tend to see them come in. There's a little blip there. The girls are two blips. One is around 3 or 4, and the
Mhm.
other one's around 13 or 14. In terms of looking at, common ages coming in. And so one is really very early on, tends to be very deep in the family, father, daughter, stepfather, daughter, and the other one tends to be sort of more peripheral family members, stepfathers or uncles or outside boyfriends of the mother or something like that who come in. So we see these two different peaks in the among the females. So there's differences in age, there's differences in duration, there's differences in coercion, there's differences in those sorts of issues. I think one other thing I'd just bring up in this context is most people don't realize how many episodes there are. When we look at the average girl in the study, The onset was about age 7, but that was somewhat misleading because they're really different age groups, and when averaged together, they yield a 7, but there's sort of a bunch of 3-year-olds and a bunch of 13-year-olds. Um, the duration is about 2 years on average, with a frequency of about once or twice a week. So you're starting to look at something like 100 to 200 episodes on average
Per person?
per person.
Okay, wow. That is
That's what's
stunning
doing.
data, honestly. Yeah,
Yes, that is stunning data. And see, most people think once or twice or something. It's happening hundreds of times. Hundreds of times.
wow. And yeah, I mean, I've heard all sorts of, horrible stories about, human trafficking and whatnot, but this is within the home.
Yep.
And obviously it's somewhat of a crime of opportunity because you have a vulnerable person who trusts you, or at least somebody in the home trusts you, and you're utilizing your influence. And so this is, yeah, I mean, this is why I'm glad that you've studied this, is because I'm hoping also on the preventative side, we can stop these numbers, right? And in educating the mothers, and if there is a father involved, educating the community members that this is a serious issue and not something to overlook. If you have any suspicion, let CPS, let Child Protective Services make the call, right? Not
That's correct. All you have to do is just have an honest suspicion. You don't
right.
have to investigate. You don't have to prove anything. You can do it anonymously. You just have to make that call, and some professionals will look into the situation.
Yeah. And I want to say that for everybody out there listening, because it does sound sort of dire in the way that this is sort of happening behind closed doors in these situations. I wonder about, I guess that's maybe another another discussion, like how do we stop the perpetrators? But I guess what I'm wondering about is, yeah, I mean, I guess that's part of my question. Has your data led you anywhere to make some larger recommendations? I mean, obviously I heard the prevention and the education with the mothers and the older folks in the home. Are there other things that have just sort of stuck out to you as things as a society or as treatment? Well, just so as a society first, that if we did these things, perhaps people would be growing up in safer environments.
Well, yes, and I certainly take advantage of that book to sort of get on the soapbox and talk about how I would change things. If I had my way, kind of thing. And certainly, I think there are things we can do in terms of the child protection system per se that could be much more helpful. I also think that we need to be supporting the mothers better. We spend a lot of money on perpetrators one way or another, and then we also spend some money on the children, but we don't spend anything on the moms,
Mm.
who often are also victims of domestic violence, and also usually have their own trauma histories from childhood on. And I think that we need to be offering much better services to them also, and basically supporting families. It's not so true in sexual abuse, but in physical abuse, I mean, financial stress, for example, has a real impact on that. So we tend to see during recessions or times of financial stress, for the numbers of physical injuries to go up for kids. In the last Great Recession, we had 2008 or so. We were seeing more than twice as many head injuries as we would see on average, for example, inflicted head injuries in these kids. So we know that financial stressors, so that when there are financial stressors happening, maybe we need to have better social services or family support systems in place at that time, for example. So I actually have put a lot of recommendations in. I sort of tease that the book is a primer on child maltreatment disguised as a memoir.
Hmm.
Uh, that this is like, okay, I'm going to take all my experiences and roll them all together, and it's going to be organized around the study because I've had that study going for almost 40 years now, along with my colleagues. But it's I also, in the meantime, ran a forensic unit. I ran uh, prevention programs in the community at fairly large scale, things like that.
Well, I mean, I think that's it. I think it's important because, like I said earlier, you've published over 200 papers. And for your average person who's just trying to make a difference, who's not in academia or in the sciences, I think this is a perfect way to start, is picking up the book. I mean, the podcast is sort of like an appetizer, sort of like you get a free sample, hear about it, and then you want to dig in further. And yeah, there's a lot of things that I think as a society we could be doing that seem like common sense but are not being enacted because our systems are older. A lot of the systems were created before some of this new data. And we see that. I think the hard part is, how do we get it to change? Well, it's going to take a lot of people doing small things, and then some people will do bigger things, I think. But I'm impressed with what you're doing because it's very much in line with what we're seeing in the field of counseling and psychology, in terms of prevention. How do we prevent these things, right? Education, support, resources. And people think, oh, what about economics? We can't get into that. Well, I'm not sure how to solve the economic issue, but economic disparity, we see drug abuse, alcohol abuse, suicide, violence, domestic violence, and how we see that statistically, right? In places where there's less resources, less money invested into the community, or wage disparity. That data is all out there in other studies.
It's really there. I mean,
it's there.
It's all there if you would care to look at it.
So
And it's pretty compelling, kind of thing. And I agree. How do we get people to act on that stuff? That's a real challenge. I think one thing is really to talk about it. I mean, it's been a taboo subject for centuries, really, and we're just really beginning to talk about it. And I think things like the Epstein survivors have been extremely important in bringing up a conversation and talking about it and sort of opening that up. But again, they're not exactly typical.
True.
When you think about it, there's a lot of differences in that experience compared to the girls who are growing up, or the children who are growing up in their home, and the perpetrator is Uncle George or whatever, and they're charged with keeping a family secret, and there's no support group, there's no other people they know who have been through this kind of experience, so they're much more alone. But that's why we have to keep talking and open that part of it up also, because they don't have a natural support group in the same way that some of the traffic group does. The Epstein survivors, or what's now come out with Chavez, or some of the other perpetrators.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good comparison to make, because in the human trafficking, there's like an obvious thing that comes out when a lot of the data comes out, but when it's part of your family of origin, or your cultural group, there's so much shame attached to it. I mean, not that there's not shame attached to the other one, but it's even like it's like culturally embedded, whereas a lot of the Epstein people were taken and victimized elsewhere outside of their family, often, not all of them, but a lot of them. And like Larry Nassar, the Michigan state doctor as well, who victimized people in his office, right? I mean, they've all kind of banded together, like a lot of the Epstein survivors, because this was, a manipulation crime.
Exactly.
And these women and girls in the families that are being manipulated and perpetrated in their own house, with a lot of the data that you've been collecting, this is an everyday thing that's happening all over the place. And so when I brought up all those statistics, it's there. We should talk about it. And also, all of those things that I brought up that affect adults, my opinion is that it affects children worse. So if that's affecting the adults in the home, it's only going to trickle down to the children, and this abuse is what we're seeing in these situations. So, and it affects people's entire lives. I mean, that's why you've done this longitudinal study. Oftentimes in therapy, people will, a lot of therapy was developed before we even knew about a lot of how to help these folks. And so some older methods will be utilized with a client, and, kind of a client who has a baseline sense of safety, a baseline sense of self, had a stable household. Some of these talk therapies only kind of get a little bit of effect with people that have gone through a lot of trauma, and they go, well, therapy doesn't work. This is ridiculous. Right. And then you have to say, well, hey, wait, more education is needed. Not that you're worse off, but you don't have the stable parents. You don't have that sense of self and identity and being loved and cared for. You were maltreated during your formative years and your sexuality and all of these things coming together. So yeah, we do need a stronger approach with you. We do need specialized techniques and more time to heal. Really, are they in a situation where they can heal? And that is not meant to stigmatize anybody, but to explain that it's important that they don't blame themselves for this. But it's kind of weird because when if I go to my doctor for a sprained ankle and my friend goes because his ankle got run over by a Jeep, we're going to have much different prognosis on the ankle and a much longer treatment plan. The issue is that you can see that with mental health. These people are walking around. You can't tell that this one was abused for 5 years in their house and this one, had, one incident of trauma or just, something that is less of a pervasive injury mentally, right? Now, both can be injured the same in terms of it's because mental health is subjective, but there's a lot there. So anyway, not to get on that soapbox, but I feel like I'm glad about your research coming out because as therapists, we need to be able to do better for our clients and dig deeper and get better training to make sure we can educate the public about this. And our profession is very much, unfortunately, into helping people after the problem, right? And so I'm hoping the future of mental health is starting to learn what we've taken from not only our clients and what we're doing, taking stuff from data like what you're doing, and how do we get this now into schools, community centers, programs to prevent with education and other programs, as simple as parenting programs. I mean, as simple as what do you do if you have a suspicion? I don't know. More prevalent. It would be nice. It would be nice. So.
Okay, well, I got to give him that speech myself. Yeah. Well, it's we know what to do in many respects. We just don't seem to have the will as much in this country to actually do it.
That's true. We have a lot of studies, a lot of excellent data, and we currently don't seem to have the push for that in our country. So that's something that hopefully we can change. And I know you also, is your blog still active on Psychology Today?
Yes. Yeah, it is.
Okay, excellent. So you have a blog, Dr. Frank Putnam's blog. If you Google or if you put into a search engine, Dr. Frank Putnam's Psychology Today blog. And of course, this book, Old Before Their Time. And I feel like you've given quite a good overview of what it's about. I think that's what I love about books that's why I'm a huge proponent of reading. And I'm always reading a new book. I've multiple books at once, audiobooks, all of that, to get the details of what he's talking about. Everyone listening, I mean, dig in. Even if you only read a couple of chapters just to kind of get understanding around it, everything becomes more understandable when you're able to read about it. So I really appreciate.
Well, thank you.
You writing this book. So
it was about 10 years in the making, and certainly the study was 40 years in the making.
Well, I very much appreciate you doing this. I mean, the ACEs study, when I first read that, it changed my entire view of psychology and counseling. So this study that you're still doing, the longitudinal study, is just even more specific and showing these biological markers is incredible. to kind of understanding the toll of abuse, trauma, and obviously, mental health and what it does to you. So I appreciate that. And I'm sure many people will appreciate hearing this episode as well. So,
well, thank you.
Yes. So thank you so much for your time. And I will be putting all of the links to the book and your websites and everything in the show notes.
All right. Well, thank you very much. It's been a pleasure to be here and talk about these things. And I think that's what we need to do everywhere is bring it out of the dark, out of the closet. That's one way to start really changing things.
Yes, it's true. Speaking the truth can cause major changes, and we've seen that in our society.
Yeah. I mean, I've been doing this for 50 years, really, and things are better. They really, really are, compared to when I started in the 70s. But there's a long way to go.
Right. Trust me. Yeah, I agree with you. I agree completely. So thank you so much for your time, and I will look forward to posting this.
Okay. Thank you for having me.
And there you have it. This has been another episode of the Intentional Clinician Podcast. If you are enjoying the show, please leave us a rating on iTunes or share the show with people you know. I would surely appreciate it. As some of you know, I am passionate about preventing future violence in the United States. I have started a nonprofit with colleagues called the National Violence Prevention Hotline, which is a 501c3 organization. We are endeavoring to gain funding and collaborators and volunteers so that we can start a 24/7 hotline and chat line to reach potential perpetrators before they may act violently. It is a bold effort to curb violence and save innocent lives by working to connect with potential offenders while they are in the planning stages of violence, help to de-escalate them, and provide resources so that they can get appropriate professional help. The National Violence Prevention Hotline is looking to open up a conversation about violence in society, the causes, and the solutions. You can learn more by visiting our website at violencepreventionhotline.org. You can get involved by writing your congressperson from our website, sharing it with your network, or even donating to the cause. If you are looking for an EMDR International Association consultant, I am a consultant and I can help provide 20 hours that you need to become EMDRIA certified. Just check out the show notes and send me a message and see if we're a good fit to work together. If you are in need of counseling, do not hesitate to make an appointment with a local counselor in your area. You can also make an appointment with the excellent clinicians at Health for Life Counseling in Grand Rapids as part of the Trauma Informed Counseling Center of Grand Rapids by visiting www.healthforlifegr.com. And if you are in the state of Michigan, you can also schedule a telehealth appointment. The recording you just listened to consists of the personal opinions of Paul Krauss and his guest, and while these are based upon the literature they have read and the experience in their respective fields, the information on this podcast should not be viewed or thought of as the definitive opinion on any subject. Listening to this podcast is not a substitute for treatment. If you're in a crisis, please call 911 or the National Crisis Line at 988. Support your local bookstore by shopping at bookshop.org. That's www.bookshop.org. It donates a percentage of sales to local bookstores all across the United States, which I think gives character to our cities and a place to hang out and a place to explore. You can order from the comfort of your own home online while supporting businesses near you. If you are a therapist and you are not involved in your local counseling or therapist or social work organization, please get involved to at least pay dues so that we can have lobbyists help keep mental health care accessible at the government level, and also expanding into schools and other places that need it. And also, if you didn't know, counseling organizations and professional organizations are working to keep us from becoming gig workers for a lot of large corporations who are coming in and trying to buy up local counseling agencies or basically pay you what they pay for people to deliver food to your house. So get involved. Until next time on The Intentional Clinician, I wish you all a safe and peaceful week.